This is what an impeachment is about. The president violated his oath of office, undermined our national security, jeopardized the integrity of our elections, tried to use the appropriations process as his private ATM machine in order to advance his personal and political advantage. That is what the senators should be looking into. And they shouldn't be frivolous with the Constitution of the United States, even though the President of the United States has.
All of us senators will pledge to rise above the petty factionalism and do justice for our institutions, for our states, and for the nation.
You're looking at a live image of the United States Capitol, where today, for the third time in history, the U.S. Senate will start an impeachment trial. This is live coverage from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. Senators have been asked to be in their seats by noon today. At that time, the Senate will receive the House managers to present the articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. At 2 p.m., Senator Grassley will swear in the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who will then swear in the senators. After the senators respond to the oath, they'll be called up in groups of 4 to sign the impeachment oath book, and senators have to sign that to sit in the trial. Well, joining me to talk about the impeachment proceedings, but also all of the breaking news about President Trump's relationships with Ukraine, is Amber Phillips, reporter for The Fix. Amber, thank you so much for being here. The real heart of the trial is expected to get underway next week on Tuesday after the Martin Luther King weekend. So today is a lot about sort of ceremony and symbolism, although we will see the impeachment managers sort of in their role for the first time. What are you watching for today? Is it all of this, or is it everything else going on with this story?
I think you're right, Libby, that today there's ceremony, but we're not expecting much of substance. It's the first time we're going to have House managers who largely represent House Democrats in their push to impeach Trump in the same room with the senators who are largely represented by Senate Republicans who control the majority in their efforts to defend Trump from impeachment. So that's notable. Mm-hmm. But we're going to see these two sides clash next week when there's opening arguments on both sides. Trump's White House lawyers will come and give opening arguments, and then senators will ask written questions. This could go on for days or even weeks. So today the imagery is symbolic, but we're going to see the real substance of this happen next week. To your point about all this news happening outside of the Senate chamber right now, that's what I'm focused on. I think you're right, it's the bigger story. Let me look at my notes to recap because it's just so much. House investigators last night continued to release documents the way they have all this week about Lev Parnas. He's somebody in Trump's orbit via his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. What we learned last night was this person who appeared to, according to documents, play a role in helping Giuliani get a quid pro quo with Ukraine to help President Trump, was also here in the States talking to President Trump's allies via a super PAC where he was a donor, but he was trying to get this super PAC to get Donald Trump Jr. to like message stuff that was bad about Biden or pro-Ukraine or, a bunch of details that are still coming out and we're still trying to piece together. This guy even had breakfast scheduled with President Trump in September, right around the whistleblower complaint. So what we have is this figure, a Ukrainian American, who is like closer and closer to the president than we realize. After that document dump, this guy, Lev Parnas, goes on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, a liberal TV host for that channel, and he said everyone knew what we were doing with this political quid pro quo. He said, Vice President Pence, Attorney General William Barr, I didn't do anything without the explicit permission of Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, or Trump himself. As my colleague Aaron Blake on The Fix points out, we're not sure what credibility Lev Parnas has. He's not somebody House impeachment investigators deposed, even subpoenaed, talked to. He's just out there. He's also under federal indictment, somewhat related to the stuff for campaign finance charges. So what credibility does he have? We don't know. But more and more documents keep showing he may have been integral to this political quid pro quo part, and therefore a witness who might know stuff.
And there's his words, but there's also, the validity, which everyone's looking into, of course, of the actual documentation that he has, whether it's like text messages or whether it's, written notes, because there's the physical evidence and then there's what he says. So two things that everyone's trying to investigate and get a sense of, because one may bolster the other.
You're right, and we don't have an answer to that. There needs to be more information coming out, which suggests there's more to this impeachment investigation, even though we're on the eve of a Senate trial to determine.
And there's a question if any more information will come out in the actual, chamber or behind that closed door. Not that senators are sequestered and living in a bubble. It's not like that kind of a trial. So they're not immune from the news. They're not immune from these breaking stories or the documentation that comes out of the House. But there is a question at this point if any of that will be introduced. Well, let's go to our colleague Rhonda Colvin, who's on Capitol Hill. Rhonda, I want to get a sense from you about some of this other news swirling around, but let's start with what we expect to see today.
That's right, Libby. It is sort of breathtaking in terms of how much news is coming out in the last 24 hours and this morning. But yes, first off, what we are about to see at noon today is a little bit more of that ceremony that we saw yesterday. Today is almost like a pregame to the Senate trial that is expected to start on Tuesday. So what we're going to see at noon is another processional where the House managers, led by Adam Schiff, will walk through Statuary Hall. They will walk through the Capitol Rotunda and make their way to the Senate chamber. Then Adam Schiff, who is the leader of House managers, he will read in entirety the articles of impeachment. And if people at home and us as well want to know how long that might take, that resolution is about 8 pages. It's not very long, but he will read all of the articles, the two, in their entirety. And then at 2, we will see Chief Justice Roberts come over from across the street from the court and come to the Senate, where he will be sworn in, and then he will swear in the Senate as impartial jurors. Now, today, again, it's just more of that ceremony that needs to happen before the trial gets underway in earnest.
Okay, so Rhonda, there have been a series of new developments in these accusations against President Trump this week, and even though the House has already impeached him. So this morning, I know you were listening to Speaker Pelosi's press conference. What is she focused on?
She and others on the Hill, a lot of people are talking right now about that Government Accountability Office report that came out. They found that President Trump did break the law by withholding that aid to Ukraine. So they are a nonpartisan agency that deals with oversight of Congress, and they said, according to them, he did break the law. So right off the bat today in Speaker Pelosi's weekly address, she started with that. She said, you see that more and more evidence has been coming. This is right after the Parnas news yesterday, and she said this calls for witnesses to come to the Senate. She said there are, multiple reasons now of why senators need to hear from witnesses, why they really need to shed light on a lot of these documents that are coming forward. So it's been a dizzying amount of news coming from the Hill in the last 24 hours. It almost makes you wonder, what are we going to see over the weekend before we even get to the trial on Tuesday? But I guess we'll all wait and see.
All right, thank you so much, Rhonda Colvin. We'll be talking with you more this morning. I want to turn back to you, Amber, and talk more about this GAO report and why this is so significant.
Yeah, let's start with what the GAO is. Government Accountability Office. They're an office within Congress. They're nonpartisan, and they are designed to give just a nonpartisan legal review of stuff. If a senator or a House member wants a law written, they can sort of help them say this is under the law now, legal, not legal. So what happened was Democrats requested the GAO to look at what we know about how Trump held up Ukraine's military aid. This is military aid that Congress approved in a bipartisan fashion, and then the White House didn't spend it. GAO came out, perhaps coincidental, on the eve of this trial with a news dump, and said, you guys broke the rules when you withheld this because you didn't notify Congress you were withholding it. The White House can have its discretion, which is what President Trump and his lawyers are arguing, to spend the money. But if they want to use that discretion, they have to notify Congress. And that's what this law is, the Impeachment Control Act, and that's what GAO is saying they didn't do. So that may seem like a procedural thing, but in the overall balance of power between Congress and the White House, it feels important. And you have Senate Democrats saying this proves if you don't abide by this law, there's executive fiat that the White House, that's the term they use, the White House can use to decide whether it spends or not spends money. That's the crux of this report from an independent office within Congress.
Let's bring Paul Soni into the conversation, national security reporter. Thanks for being here. One thing that riles up senators is when they're not consulted and when they're not brought into the process. And so we did see some pushback even from Republicans over President Trump's actions with Iran over the past 2 weeks, as they've had real questions about just how far the president would go and whether or not he would consult with Congress when it comes to war powers. So we do see that members of the House and Senate, they want to have a role. They don't want to be shut out of this process. So when a report comes out like this from GAO, I mean, could that bother some senators or raise some concerns?
I mean, one of the things to note about that is that you see in the email traffic that has come out from between the Pentagon and the White House concerns about violating the Impoundment Control Act. The Pentagon is essentially saying, like, we need to abide by the law, and OMB keeps adding footnotes in order to delay the funding, and they're saying, we can't guarantee that this money is going to go out the door by the end of the fiscal year. So, we know that throughout this whole drama, there were actually concerns about violating the Impoundment Control Act.
And we know that 2 OMB officials resigned, in part. Another OMB official testified because of legal concerns about this.
Right. So, that whole element in terms of, a lot of the Republican argument is there were no laws broken. This wasn't included in the impeachment charges, but this certainly was a concern for officials who were working on the matter at the time.
And it gets at the heart of the question of just why would those funds be withheld, and who was making that decision.
Right. And to your point about senators and Congress being concerned about what you said, is executive fiat over the use of government funds. You see the exact same thing happening over the fight over the wall funding, right? Where the Trump administration and the White House has essentially diverted funds that Congress appropriated for other things at the Pentagon and using that instead on the wall. And that is that's going through the courts now, whether or not that is legal, because the Democrats in Congress are arguing that Congress has the power of the purse. We're giving money to rebuild a school and a military base, and you are just deciding to use that money on something else, and that undermines the whole process. If you continue to do that, they can fund priorities at the Pentagon, and then the president can just use the money for whatever he wants.
I think this speaks to a broader concern within Congress about the Trump White House and the Trump administration steamrolling them. And Democrats are going to be out there saying that more than Republicans.
Right.
Republicans, though, have been willing to let the Trump administration do this without their permission, like spend money in ways they haven't done that, not consult them about Iran, and you have Republicans out there defending the president using this really broad executive power.
And then some complaining at the same time. So on the wall, what you see is Republican senators coming out and saying, I support the wall, I want the wall to get built. It's too bad that the Democrats aren't giving the president the money that he should be given for the wall. But really, I don't like this situation where you're essentially through the back door raiding the Pentagon budget, because I want to fund our military and I signed off on these priorities. So you kind of see some Republican politicians trying to strike a balance there. But as you point out, generally speaking, there isn't a lot of blowback for the president for doing this.
So this question comes up about why not then have more witnesses, right? Why not get to the heart of some of these answers? Why not have Mick Mulvaney come testify? Why not hear more from OMB? Why not hear more about the sort of the decision-making process? And then, of course, based on your latest reporting, Paul, so many questions about just what the Attorney General may have known, just what the Vice President may have known. So where does that leave us with this question? We'll start with you, Amber, of witnesses and getting additional information introduced to the Senate trial.
I don't know how to answer that because I think it gets difficult for Senate Republicans to say we don't want to hear any more witnesses, but it's always been difficult on the face logically for them to say that. So they can still hold the line, especially when you have the White House, our White House colleagues reported yesterday, previewing this broad executive power as a defense for not having people like John Bolton or Mick Mulvaney testify, saying, could you imagine the slippery slope that would create? One of you guys wants to be president, and then you're going to feel like your national security aides and your private conversations could be televised for the entire nation in a Senate impeachment trial. I can see that resonating with Republicans who just want to protect the Trump and therefore their own political careers and not have witnesses.
I think also you just have to step away and see the weirdness of all of this, where we're debating whether or not witnesses can happen in a trial, and it's like evidence is coming out, everything is moving forward, and there are no rules of the road, right? And that just doesn't happen in a normal trial. Everyone's kind of comparing this to normal, there were no charges that were criminal, or like, this should be like a normal trial. This is not a normal trial, because in a normal, proceeding in a U.S. court, there are rules about evidence, what you can bring into evidence, what you can have in terms of testimony, whether you can have witnesses or not. And we're in this very unique situation where there's this huge, on the eve of all of this going forward, there's this huge tidal wave of new information, and then questions about how is this handled, because this isn't a court of law and there are no rules. The framers didn't put any rules in the Constitution about how this Senate trial should be handled.
So Paul, let's talk about two major aspects of the news that broke last night. One was seeing Lev Parnas go on MSNBC and share with Rachel Maddow who he says knew what.
He's coming for round 2 on CNN.
And it's coming for round 2 on CNN. Okay, great. And now also we saw these documents coming out from the House Democrats released last night. So take us through these two pieces of information and what the biggest takeaways are.
So there are so many takeaways because, as you know, Lev Parnas was Rudy Giuliani's main conduit to everyone in Ukraine, right? So Rudy Giuliani is not a Russian speaker. He has been to Ukraine before and has had dealings with Ukrainians, but he's not. He needs someone to make things happen, and there has to be a rubber hits the road when in terms of getting what he wanted out of the Ukrainian prosecutors and out of Ukrainian officials. And Lev Parnas was the main person doing all of that. And so what we have on the eve of this all going forward is all of his communications with Ukrainian prosecutors, with Rudy Giuliani, with lawyers associated with Rudy Giuliani, with people at the Trump Super PAC, America First. And so all of this is pretty important information if you're trying to piece together what exactly was happening over the course of last year, how the president was involved, how the vice president was involved, what Rudy Giuliani was doing and when and why. So all of this has kind of exploded into the public view. Parnas is now suddenly also giving public interviews where he's making additional claims that aren't necessarily, he's making based on his own observations, true or false, but aren't necessarily supported in the documentary evidence.
Right, like he's like, so-and-so knew about this, of course he must have, which is really just an assumption on his part.
Right, either assumption on his part or speculation, or maybe he knows something, he just didn't say when he was, we really don't know, and I think we have to look at those assertions on their face and say, like, what is actually in the text messages that happen during the time period? That I think that gives you a better sense, and is better to rely on when you look at evidence. People are much more interested usually in relying on contemporaneous messages which were sent, without knowing that this was all going to get a public hearing in Congress, versus like recollections about who knew what. Right.
Which speaks to your point you made earlier, Paul, about how weird this all is.
Exactly, right.
Would you have like a potential top witness in a criminal trial going on CNN or MSNBC and just throwing out accusations?
And let's be clear, Lev Parnas is also facing a criminal trial. So that also makes it kind of strange, right? That he is speaking publicly as he's also facing, a criminal indictment.
So one really revealing thing was Susan Collins was, caught by CNN yesterday, and she was really a bit dismissive of the Lev Parnas information that had come out the night before, sort of asking like, why this now? Like, why now? And blaming House Democrats for the timing of this, which is important because she's one of those few Republican senators who could demand that witnesses, be called, that there be more of an airing of just exactly what happened, that there could be more information gathering in the Senate trial phase. And she sort of dismissed it all and chalked up to politics, Amber. This gets to your question of, will it be harder for Republicans to keep resisting the need to hear more fact-finding happen as part of this Senate process?
Right. I think politically, objectively, from a political lens, it's unfair to expect Senate Republicans to dig into allegations that could unseat a president of their party and affect their reelection. And reading between the lines of Susan Collins and some other moderates, that's what I hear them say. I hear them say is, listen, House Democrats, you could have proven to me beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump is guilty in all this, but you didn't, you rushed it, you played politics, and I'm not going to do your lifting for you.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised by her comments in the sense that, she is one of the jurors in the trial. She's one of the most influential members of the Senate in shaping how this trial will go forward. And as far as I understand, the reason that it didn't come out earlier is that the House didn't have them. And it was surprising to me that she didn't know that. Her comments seemed to suggest that she thought the House was holding back this information and purposely sort of dumping it all on the eve of the trial. But as far as I understand, the issue is that Parnas hadn't handed over the information. Initially, the claim from Parnas' side was, oh, we can't do it in time. And then there were questions about the criminal trial and what he could hand over, what the court would permit him to hand over and be made public. And as far as I understand, they only got this at the last minute. And that's why, it's being dumped right on the eve of the Senate trial. This isn't really great for House Democrats either, to be honest, the timing of everything, because it was literally dumped right in the middle of a Democratic debate. They want, in their mind, they want to get it out there at a time when everyone can pour through it, can look at it. So it's not really ideal for them either, right? But I do think it does, to your point, go to questions that the Republicans had against the Democrats about why was this all so fast, right?
There was so much criticism about the procedure and the process, and even Republicans who didn't seem quite ready to defend Trump on the actions could be very clearly critical of the process that House Democrats were going through.
And there are questions about what do the House Democrats expect senators to do with this information, and how do they expect them to digest it? I mean, they pulled out some of the text messages and translated them from Russian and sort of went through them, but then they dumped an entire tidal wave of text messages that aren't even translated in Russian. I was translating them from our stories. We haven't translated them totally. So, how are Republican senators supposed to digest this information? When are they supposed to digest it? And it's not. It's pretty complicated stuff, right? This is, contemporaneous text messages between Lev Parnas and Ukrainian prosecutors that requires an understanding of the Ukrainian political context, what was happening, meetings that they had or didn't have at the time to understand what's actually being discussed. It's not that simple, right?
I think House managers probably have a decision to make too. It's on Tuesday, excuse me, if they're the ones going first, are they going to spend all their time explaining this stuff rather than the broad case they've spent months trying to put together against President Trump? Like, it's all just thrown up in the air and we'll see where it lands. It's just so chaotic right now.
Yeah, and the timing question is a real tricky one, because you understand from the House Democrats' perspective, they don't want an impeachment investigation running into an election. They're going to get accused of, we're running these impeachment proceedings right into the election in order to have something that's undermining Trump the whole way. It will seem like it's not a clean election. And so, there were a lot of considerations here on both sides, right? And they also were facing a situation where the Trump administration was not allowing them to call witnesses. And at some point, you probably have to say, this is the fullest story we can get for now, and we need to move forward with the process. So I think there were hard calls there.
Paul Sonny and Amber Phillips, thanks so much. We just saw Leader McConnell go through the hallway there and enter the Senate chamber. We can see other senators gathering there, including presidential candidates. So we'll keep watching that feed, and we'll bring the Senate to you live and uninterrupted once the proceedings get underway. Let's go back to Capitol Hill and our colleague Rhonda Colvin. Rhonda, let's talk about these impeachment managers that were named by Speaker Pelosi yesterday, the people to watch as this trial process gets underway.
That's right. There's 7 of them, and that is nearly half as many as in the Clinton impeachment. There were 13 at that time. And yesterday we noted how Speaker Pelosi must have had a strategy when she picked those 7 members. There was diversity in race, diversity in gender. There was also, and this was a little underreported too, but there was diversity in geography. That was something that a lot of Republicans have criticized the Democrats in the House for during this whole impeachment investigation, that a lot of the people handling the investigation were from both coasts. I remember during one of the public hearings, there was a sign behind Representative Jim Jordan that said the 2 coasts are handling the impeachment. But what you see with these impeachment managers is they were picked from different states. We have somebody from Colorado, we have Texas, we have Florida. So that might have also been a nod to the fact that we are going to pick people from across the country. So I think each individual is going to be important to watch. I think in their own right, you have a freshman with Representative Crow from Colorado. Not too many people know much about him. He is a veteran. He also does have a legal background, and he is a freshman. So I think eyes will be on him. You have Val Demings, who I know with my experiences sitting in a lot of these public hearings, she is a bit of an orator. She usually commands attention when she speaks. So that's going to be very interesting. She was the first police chief in Orlando, Florida. So she does come with a law enforcement background. And then you have somebody like Representative Garcia from Texas. She spent time as a judge there, spent 5 terms as a judge in Houston. So there's a lot of legal background among the 7 there, and a few of them too were very pro-impeachment early on. So it's going to be very interesting to watch each one of them.
All right, Rhonda Colvin, thank you so much from Capitol Hill. So let's talk about the day and what exactly is coming up. Senators have been asked to be in their seats by noon today, and we will see these impeachment articles brought in by the impeachment managers from the House. We expect to see Chairman Schiff read the articles themselves, and you can see he'll just be going through it line by line, page by page, presenting that to the Senate. And then there's a little bit of like business as usual as members of the caucus, like the Democrats, go to their regularly scheduled lunch and do their regular business. This afternoon, then everything really gets underway here as Senator Grassley, who's Senate pro temp, he's the most senior Republican. He'll be swearing in the Chief Justice, John Roberts, and Roberts will in turn swear in the senators. Amber Phillips, you wrote a great piece for The Fix about this oath of impartiality senators will take. What senators are swearing to is related to like a trial oath. It's not related to the oath that you would take normally, like as a member of Congress, as a member of the Senate. So let's talk about the text of this and its significance.
Sure. Past Senate trials and Senate rules past the 1980s have what they're going to do today, really ceremonial, dramatic process where they solemnly swear, this is what we think it'll say, in all things that pertaining to the trial of the impeachment of President Donald Trump now pending, I will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help me God. I get questions from readers all the time, Libby. How can they take that oath today and then go out there and say they have this predetermined view of whether Trump's guilty or not? A lot of times people mention Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying we're going to work hand in hand with the White House on this, and then accusing Democrats of having a flimsy case, suggesting he takes this oath, but he already thinks
He's
Trump.
already made up his mind.
He's already made up his mind. The answer that I came to after studying the rules and talking to constitutional scholars is admittedly a cynical one, but in this setting, impartiality is subjective. Like Mitch McConnell could say, well, I took that oath of impartiality, and what I mean by that is I'm going to protect the president from what I see as Democrats' political overreach. To me, that's impartial. And then even if senators were to break their own version of impartiality, there's nothing in the rules of the trial holding them to that. Like there's no punishment. There's no rule that says Chief Justice John Roberts is going to eject a senator for being like not impartial or asking a leading question or going on cable news afterward and sharing their opinion. So like the political incentive to defend the president if you're a Republican senator is stronger than any political incentive, if there even is one, to be truly, truly impartial.
Amber Phillips, my guest here, as we watch the Senate convene here. They just got a few minutes to get into the chamber, get in their chairs. Senator Grassley is in there already. He'll be the one at the very top of things. You can see him right there with the gavel. And he will be presiding over this historic impeachment trial. It's not typical for senators to stay quiet, Amber. I mean, you're elected to Congress, you're a talker.
Right.
And even the filibuster is something that senators are known for, right? Talking and talking endlessly for hours, even days at a time. They have to be quiet here. They have to be recipients of this information. Even presenting their questions, we assume, will be the process in written form, submitting them in written form. Very different role for senators to take.
The the rules put place in the 1980s, as I understand it, did that to prevent grandstanding because, like you said, senators like to talk, and this trial is about the president, not them. They're the jurors. They also have to surrender their cell phones. So they're going to sit there, and it's very rare to have all 100 senators sit there. Normally you get in the chamber, you vote, you give your speech, you get out, and you do other stuff. they're stuck there and they're not used to that. And they're going to be stuck there for days and days and days and hours and hours and hours and weeks on end. And I said this on your show yesterday, I think that's where Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's counting on when he has a vote on witnesses for Republicans to say, no, I'm out, I'm done. This is pretty mind-numbing.
You can see the Democratic Council coming across now, some faces that you'll remember from the presentation of the evidence and some of the questioning that happened during the House phase of this, and the Intel Committee and the Judiciary Committee.
Yeah. One note I thought was interesting is that I talked to a former Senate historian who said during the Clinton trial, House Republicans asked parliamentarians if they could have their lawyers be the managers in a Senate trial because they're lawyers. And the answer was no, it has to be members of Congress. So you can see Nancy Pelosi try to focus who her House managers would be with people with law backgrounds and experience in the courtroom. But as we see from this procession, obviously they're going to be heavily staffed by their staff who are actual lawyers.
Daniel Goldman and others who, like I said, we did see during the House phase of the process. You know, we saw the route walked last night from the House over to the Senate as the clerk of the House, Cheryl Johnson, carried the impeachment articles over to the Senate, escorted by the Sergeant at Arms in the House, Paul Irving. The Sergeant at Arms we usually see every year at the State of the Union, and so the next time that the Sergeant at Arms will be in the public eye will likely be on that State of the Union night, introducing the President of the United States as he comes into the House chamber. Such a different moment, Amber, from what the Sergeant at Arms was doing yesterday, escorting the House clerk as well as the impeachment managers over from one chamber to the other chamber on this historic occasion. We have the State of the Union scheduled for February 4th. It could certainly be pushed back. I mean, there's nothing written in the law that says it has to be that night. But at this point, the trial is about to bump up against that big moment for the president.
It could even be that he is giving his State of the Union to a Congress where one half is debating whether to convict or acquit him. That is actually exactly what happened to President Bill Clinton during his trial. And our congressional colleague, Paul Kane, who was covering Congress for that, said Bill Clinton that whole time did not mention impeachment, not once during his State of the Union, even though it's what everyone was focused on. I have absolutely no idea what Trump's strategy would be in such a situation. But like you said, Libby, it's possible that this gets pushed back. He comes to an agreement with Nancy Pelosi to not be in such an awkward situation.
So the Senate's voting right now on USMCA. This is the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, and we did see Leader McConnell yesterday pivot in his comments right from impeachment to, and we'll be getting USMCA accomplished. And Leader McConnell giving credit to President Trump in the White House for that. So it was like, if you're watching President Trump, I've still got your back, right? We may be in this impeachment process, but I'm still giving you credit, and in front of the American public, giving props to the White House for accomplishing something else, even as this goes on.
And it is a huge accomplishment, and a bipartisan one at that. That's going to go, you know, in President Trump's Wikipedia page, what we remember him for. That it's coming on the eve of a Senate trial, or like basically the day of the Senate trial, is a big symbolic deal for President Trump. It's a way for him to say to the American people, look what I'm doing, and then compare that to Democrats trying to throw me out of office. We know that he might be going to Davos, a World Economic Forum in Switzerland. Another great opportunity for him, if he does go, to sort of present himself as president focused on things for the American people while this is happening. And House Democrats are arguing that the Senate should kick him out in an election year. You know, I think the imagery there is important for President Trump, and a good one. That being said, our White House colleagues have reported that Trump's aides aren't sure if they can keep him away from the Senate trial. We know during the House impeachment process, he was live tweeting. Members of Congress would say stuff, he'd respond. Sometimes he'd say something, and a member of Congress on his side would pick it up and express that argument to the witnesses. It's very possible that Trump sort of undermines the good public relations image he's going to have by being out there and being president, by instead tweeting about the trial. Yeah,
there's a lot of concern about that, including from members of the Senate, you know, who are worried that instead of just sort of letting his lawyers do the job, that the president will engage on Twitter, which will make their jobs even harder. So you can see the House impeachment managers coming across Statuary Hall and heading over to the Senate. There they are, all 7 of them. And we expect Chairman Schiff to be the one to read from the articles of impeachment today. You see the Sergeant at Arms there coming over as well as part of this escort.
You know, there was some talk as the impeachment inquiry was ramping up and President Trump was like refusing to let any documents or witnesses come through, is could the House invoke what's called inherent contempt, which would be to literally put people in jail for not complying with their subpoenas. That would require the Sergeant of Arms to do that. I talked to congressional historians who said that backfired in like the 19th century in terms of public sentiment, and also Congress doesn't have a jail. So like, it wouldn't be clear where the Sergeant of Arms would go throw people into. But the fact that that was an actual conversation being held among members of Congress speaks to how frustrated Democrats were about getting the Trump White House to cooperate with this impeachment inquiry. And ultimately, they struggled on that front.
It's not often that members of the House head over to the Senate, right? Senators go over to the House for State of the Union. But as we watch these impeachment managers walk across the Capitol, they're going through Statuary Hall. They're also going under the rotunda, this incredibly grand and beautiful space that they walk through as they come through the Capitol and head over to the Senate. This is a walk that's only happened, you know, a few times in U.S. history. This is only the 3rd time that a trial will get underway in the Senate. You see all the media there. Media has been very concerned, news outlets very concerned at sort of the lack of access that's been granted to journalists in the course of this process. You see so many photojournalists there trying to capture this moment in history.
Yeah, C-SPAN shared a letter they wrote yesterday to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying, get our cameras in the Senate, because the Senate controls the cameras that we see, and they don't always get every angle and every moment.
Let's listen in to what Mitch McConnell is saying, the head of the Senate, and Chuck Grassley, Senate Pro Temp.
Having arrived and a quorum being present, the Sergeant at Arms will present the managers on the part of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, I announce the presence of the managers on the part of the House of Representatives to conduct proceedings on behalf of the House concerning the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
On the part of the House will be received and escorted to the well of the Senate. The Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The managers on the part of the House will now proceed.
Mr. President, the managers on the part of the House of Representatives are present and ready to present the articles of impeachment, which have been preferred by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The House adopted the following resolution, which, with the permission of the Senate, I will read. House Resolution 798, appointing and authorizing managers for the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States. Resolved that Mr. Schiff, Mr. Nadler, Ms. Lofgren, Mr. Jeffries, Ms. Demings, Mr. Crow, and Ms. Garcia of Texas are appointed managers to conduct the impeachment trial against Donald John Trump, President of the United States, that a message be sent to the Senate to inform the Senate of these appointments, and that the managers so appointed may, in connection with the preparation and conduct of the trial, exhibit articles of impeachment to the Senate and take all other actions necessary, which may include the following: employing legal, clerical, and other necessary assistance and incurring such other expenses as may be necessary to be paid from amounts available to the Committee on the Judiciary under applicable expense resolutions or from the applicable account of the House of Representatives. Number 2, sending for persons and papers and filing with the Secretary of the Senate on the part of the House of Representatives any pleadings in conjunction with or subsequent to the exhibition of the articles of impeachment that the managers may consider necessary. With the permission of the Senate, I will now read the articles of impeachment, House Resolution 755. House Resolution 755, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. Resolved that Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and that the following articles of impeachment be exhibited to the United States Senate. Articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives of the United States of America in the name of itself and of the people of the United States of America against Donald John Trump, President of the United States of America, in maintenance and support of its impeachment against him for high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 1, abuse of power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his high office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his reelection, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In so doing, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. Number one, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into a political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia, alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. Number two, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, conditioned two official acts on the public announcement that he had requested. A, the release of $91 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Number 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine, but has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the power of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committees undertaking the investigation served subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to exercise the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. Number 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. Number 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, the Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. Directing current and former, number 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Preston Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of the impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Mr. President, that completes the exhibition of the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The managers request that the Senate take order for the trial. The managers now request leave to withdraw.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. The Senate will duly notify the House of Representatives when it is ready to proceed to trial.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
For the information of senators, pursuant to yesterday's order, at 2 o'clock today, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of the articles of impeachment. The Chief Justice of the United States will preside over the trial as required in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the United States Constitution. Also, under the previous order, the presiding officer has been authorized to appoint a committee of 4 senators, 2 upon the recommendation of the Majority Leader and 2 upon the recommendation of the Democratic leader, to escort the Chief Justice into the Senate chamber. I ask that the presiding officer do so now.
The chair, pursuant to Order January 15, 2020, on behalf of the Majority Leader and the Democratic leader, appoints Mr. Blunt of Missouri, Mr. Leahy of Vermont, Mr. Graham of South Carolina, and Mrs. Feinstein of California to escort the Chief Justice of the United States into the Senate chamber.
So for the further information of senators, there will be a live quorum call prior to the arrival of the Chief Justice at 2 p.m. today. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Senator Grassley hitting the gavel there, and so the Senate is in recess until about 2 o'clock this afternoon, and you can see the impeachment managers walking back through the Capitol over to the House side. I'm Libby Casey, and you're watching live coverage from the Washington Post with my guest, Amber Phillips, reporter for The Fix. Amber, I want to just reflect as we have heard Chairman Schiff read the impeachment articles, because it really does bring it back to the basics of what is at the heart of Democrats' concerns, complaints, and what they find to be impeachable offenses. What stood out to you as you heard Chairman Schiff read from this?
Yeah, it's nothing close watchers of impeachment haven't heard before, that he abused his power by trying to leverage Ukraine policy for his own political benefit, and then essentially that he tried to cover that up by trying to blockade impeachment investigation into what he did wrong by just not letting any of his White House aides talk or any Trump administration officials talk. So abuse of power and obstruction of Congress are the two impeachment articles. I was watching this from the perspective of President Trump, and this is like the opposite moment he wanted. We know in the past couple of days and weeks he's urged Senate Republicans to just take a vote to dismiss the trial. Don't even hear my defense team come out and defend me. Just like don't even have this moment where you're talking about what I may have done wrong. And I think that speaks to him potentially feeling like needled by House Democrats. And they just, Nancy Pelosi, keeps saying with a purpose, he's impeached for life. Because I feel like she knows that he's super frustrated that he's impeached. We've had our White House colleague Ashley Parker on, and she has said as much. He doesn't want to be impeached. So today, you had House Democrats have the stage, not only on the Senate floor, but with a nation who's covering this, read a 9-page document of why they think he is no longer fit to serve. And I feel like that's a frustrating moment for the president.
Our colleagues who are based on Capitol Hill today are talking to senators as they catch them in the halls about just what they think in terms of hearing from witnesses, because this Lev Parnas information that's come out, both in the accusations he lobbed last night on national television, as well as the documents that have come out from the House Democrats over the past 2 evenings, raise a lot of questions. So, we're not seeing Republicans give much ground here, though.
Right, I think that's right. The main question is, okay, with all this new information, are you now, do you want to have witnesses? Because with all the information House Democrats have gathered, the answer was no for what we think could be a majority of Republicans, and that's all they need to have no witnesses. What we hear from our congressional colleagues talking to these senators is like, maybe we'll hear from witnesses, maybe we won't. We're going to have to take that vote. That is slightly less of a line than they've had in the past, but I think you're right, Libby.
Okay, so there's like a crack, maybe a crack there, a crack in the door.
Yeah, but I don't see them like giving much ground at all. They could just be saying, maybe we will, maybe we won't, because they think it might look politically bad for them to say no witnesses at all.
And as Paul pointed out, everyone's still trying to just digest exactly what's come out from this Parnas news and information. To shut the door right now might seem premature if everyone's still trying to understand what it means, verify the factual nature of it, and so on and so forth. Now, what Mitch McConnell has called for is everything to get underway and the decision to be made later about witnesses. That's how this is proceeding at this point.
Yeah, he said as Nancy Pelosi was holding back these documents, it gave him time to gather support from a majority of Senate Republicans to have a vote on Tuesday about how this trial is going to go, how long it's going to be, what order they're going to have certain votes, and the key one being witnesses. And he managed to convince the majority of Republicans that first you hear the opening arguments and then you decide if you want to hear more, just like the Bill Clinton trial did.
Amber Phillips with the fix. There's going to be a lot of split screen moments here over the next couple of days as we head into next week. But we do expect it to go quiet over the weekend. Now, that doesn't mean the news will stop, but the impeachment trial process will be on pause after this afternoon. The plan is to come back in on Tuesday after the Martin Luther King holiday this weekend. But USMCA passage happening in the Senate. We also see more news coming out from Lev Parnas possibly as he makes the rounds on national television and talks to journalists. And then, it's this long weekend that traditionally is a time for respect, reflection, community involvement, volunteerism, thinking about the legacy of one of the nation's leaders, Martin Luther King. But the news isn't going to stop.
No, not at all. And I think we haven't heard from President Trump yet in terms of what just happened today in opening the Senate trial. So I will be watching his Twitter feed for any news that happens. I think you're right to also watch this character, Lev Parnas, this Ukrainian American who is in Trump's orbit, and through these document dumps that House Democrats are sharing with us through information they've just received, might be even more than in President Trump's orbit than we realize. I'm watching senators back home. It's normally a time where local media get to talk to them, and sometimes
Great
they're
point.
like a little more relaxed and forthcoming. Is there any news there? Do we find out maybe who the fourth potential senator is on the Republican side who could flip this debate about witnesses over to the Democrats?
Yeah, great point. And we also see this trade deal with China. That is something that President Trump is touting. And then what else is the president doing? He's going to issue new guidance on prayer in public schools. So something that he hopes appeals to his base at this time that he is under the public spotlight. And it's the last chance that some of these presidential candidates may be able to be trying to storm their way through Iowa and New Hampshire as they get ready to settle down here in the Senate and get ready for this trial.
Yeah, it's potential, or it's likely that they're in from like 1 p.m. to, who knows, 6, 7, 8 p.m., 6 days a week, all the way through and including the Iowa caucus. So, and some of these senators might have enough money to hire a private jet and like get out the door and go to Des Moines, and then like overnight campaign. I don't know who's going to come to like an 11 p.m. rally and then come right back. It's not an easy life for them for the next couple weeks.
All right, well, Amber Phillips, thank you so much. So you've been watching live coverage here at the Washington Post. We will be with you this afternoon when the Senate comes back in. We expect that to be at 2 o'clock. That's when Senate Pro Temp Chuck Grassley will swear in the Chief Justice, who will then, in turn, swear in the senators, and we'll bring that to you live. So we'll be back on air with anchored coverage at 1:30 Eastern Time with our Washington Post reporters and more analysis. In the meantime, you can subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube or on our website, to support Washington Post journalism and to be alerted about all of this breaking news that's happening. So I'm Libby Casey. We'll see you soon. You can stay tuned to this feed, especially if you're watching on YouTube. We'll keep it up, and we'll rejoin you in person at 1:30 this afternoon. Thanks so much.
This is what an impeachment is about. The president violated his oath of office, undermined our national security, jeopardized the integrity of our elections, tried to use the appropriations process as his private ATM machine in order to advance his personal and political advantage. That is what the senators should be looking into. And they shouldn't be frivolous with the Constitution of the United States, even though the President of the United States has.
All of us senators will pledge to rise above the petty factionalism and do justice for our institutions, for our states, and for the nation.
You're watching live coverage from the Washington Post. In a half hour, we will see Senate Pro Tem Chuck Grassley swear in the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. He will then in turn swear in the senators for the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. I'm Libby Casey. Welcome to our live coverage. I'm joined now in our studio by two of my Washington Post colleagues, Tolu Orunapa, national politics reporter Michael Shear. Tolu, since you cover the White House, let's talk about how President Trump is monitoring all of this right now. What is the big takeaway on how the White House is feeling, and President Trump in particular is feeling about this impeachment process?
Yeah, you have two different factions. You have the president himself, and then you have the White House around the president. The White House trying to put together a professional operation, saying that the president's lawyers, his legal team, are going to take the lead role in defending him in the Senate. They're not going to have members of the House, some of these warriors that the president calls, who are more combative, maybe more TV ready, but not necessarily as well steeped in legal maneuvering. Instead, you're going to have the president's professional legal team come to the Senate, and they've told reporters that they want this to be a very swift trial. They want this to be taken going forward without any witnesses, without any additional documents. They said that the House had their chance to provide their strongest case for impeachment. They say that the case is very, very thin, and they're going to try to move this through the process very quickly. That's something that Mitch McConnell, the leader in the Senate, has also said that he's trying to do. Now, President Trump has gone back and forth about whether or not he wants a lengthy trial, whether or not he wants to have witnesses that he thinks will be favorable to his argument, witnesses like Hunter Biden, like Joe Biden, the former vice president, and a potential political candidate running for president against President Trump. So it really has been a lot of vacillating by the president, deciding what kind of trial he wants. It seems at this point he is on board with a swift trial. He wants to get this behind him. He wants to move on to other things, and he's going to be paying a lot of attention to the trial, to how it plays on television, and to how people who are defending him, not only in the chamber but also outside of the chamber, are going on the airwaves on television and defending him. He wants that to be done very strongly all across various TV networks as the trial takes place.
I mean, some of these flamethrower House members, the Republicans who have been really vocal supporters of President Trump, they could have had a role here in the Senate trial, but as you point out, there's all this airwave time potentially on television. So it sounds like, based on your reporting and others in the newsroom, that those House members may be front and center on the TV airwaves, launching their defense of President Trump, not in this trial courtroom setting, but in front of the TV cameras, which President Trump, I'm sure, will be consuming, right? So that may help him feel like he's got a robust defense happening.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And while this trial is taking place in the Senate, the actual members of the Senate, even Republicans in the Senate, have to be silent during the trial. They can't really speak for a good chunk of the trial. So President Trump will be waiting for the commercial breaks and for after the trial is over to see who's going to defend him on television, including some of these House members who have spent a lot of time looking at this information because this impeachment went through the House first. They have said that they are very well steeped in the information. They know all the best points to make. They know the best ways to defend the president, and they know the president's going to be watching. So they're going to be going on Fox News and other channels to try to defend the president, to try to say that this is a hoax and a sham. We've already seen some combative lawmakers trying to shut down reporters, calling reporters hacks, and the president's campaign has tweeted that out and said that that is something that they like. So the president wants a very combative approach to these articles of impeachment, and he's going to get that from the House members who are going to be on TV talking about this. Okay,
so Michael, you cover this 2020 campaign. You're hearing from the candidates, you're talking to their staffers. As Tolu points out, these senators have to sit quietly and sort of absorb and consume what's presented to them in this trial process, perhaps even asking questions in written form. So there really aren't these opportunities or moments where they can show the American public how engaged they might be, or how they're still there, right?
Yeah.
So what's going through the minds of the staffers and the teams who've got candidates who are going to be locked down in this trial for the coming weeks?
Yeah, silent is not really where you want to be 2 weeks before an election. And all these candidates in the Democratic race right now, including the 3 senators who are polling near the top in Iowa, would rather be in Iowa. But they've known this has been coming for a long time, so it's sort of not really an October surprise, but it's something they have to get through. And they've all basically adopted the same posture, which is, can't do anything about this. I'm going to try and do the best I can. You know, a couple of the candidates have been deploying their family. There are lots of surrogates who are going to be in Iowa. People like Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota is planning teletown halls to try and get in there. A lot of them have been studying the Senate schedule from the 1999 impeachment. And what's interesting about that is there actually were breaks during the trial where the Senate didn't meet. And so there's still some hope that they will be able to get out to Iowa if there's a break to, you know, take depositions for witnesses or something like that. But essentially, right now, you know, for Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar and Michael Bennet, to a lesser extent, they're only going to have 3 days a week to campaign. They're going to have, you know, Saturday night maybe if they get out in time, Sunday and Monday morning, maybe into the night. Martin Luther King holiday's coming up, so that'll help. And the rest of the time they're going to have to be doing it from a distance. That'll have the biggest impact on someone like Klobuchar, who doesn't have the same operation scale or television presence or grassroots effort on the ground. The other thing I'd point out about how this is impacting the race, and it's sort of counterintuitive and interesting, Joe Biden, who is mentioned all the time in the context of impeachment, who many of us thought impeachment could be a real bad thing for, is actually embracing it in the final weeks of this campaign. He's been running ads, you know, with President Trump repeating his name over and over again, saying, there's a reason the president is obsessed with me. He knows I'm going to win. He's arguing that the fact that all this happened, this, you know, huge adventure in Ukraine to get information on what his son did in that country and what his role was, is just evidence of his own electability. And it's an interesting dynamic because he's actually going to be able to be in Iowa. Pete Buttigieg is going to be in Iowa on the ground doing events. And it'll end up being a sort of dueling competition between those who can get national airtime and on cable news and those who will be on the ground.
And we just saw John Roberts, of course, the Chief Justice, going in to the building there, so we'll be watching for when he enters the Senate chambers, and we will see this procedural drama begin to unfold this afternoon as the Chief Justice is sworn in, and then as he in turn swears in the senators. They'll do that as a group, and then they'll have to come up in batches and sign their names in this impeachment oath book. This is all part of sort of this very ceremonial sort of pomp and circumstance moment. Tolu, it really hits at the history here and the gravity of this moment. We heard Chairman Schiff read this impeachment resolution you've got in front of you, these 2 articles earlier today. Despite all sort of the noise happening and all of the agenda items the president has, it doesn't take away from this sort of, as I even pause in my words, right, like the substance of this moment that's happening. Only the 3rd president ever in the history of America to go through this process.
Yeah, the Senate sees itself as the greatest deliberative body. This is only the 3rd time that it's hosting a trial to determine one of the biggest questions in American politics. Should we remove an American president from office, or should we retain him even though he has been impeached by the House for alleged high crimes and misdemeanors? And even before Schiff read the articles of impeachment, you saw the Sergeant of Arms say, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. Everyone has to sit down and remain silent on pain of imprisonment, because that's the same language that was used during Clinton's impeachment, and that's the same language that has governed even impeachments that happened in the 1800s with President Andrew Johnson. So it's not a small thing that's happening, and I think it's starting to weigh on a number of these senators that realize that they are going to be part of something that's going to be studied by the history books. And I think President Trump has already started to talk about that as well. The fact that he said that this is a stigma that's going to be attached to his name forever because he's being judged in this impeachment process, and that he has already been impeached by the House, and now the Senate has to decide whether or not to keep him or remove him. I do think that it's pretty clear from what we've heard from a number of senators that the outcome of this trial is likely that the president will not be removed from office. You have to have a 2/3 vote. You have to have an overwhelming bipartisan majority in order to remove a president from office, and that doesn't appear that we're going to have that. But other than that, the way this trial is going to take place, the potential twists and turns, surprise endings, surprise new pieces of information, we've already begun to see that even before the trial started with, Lev Parnas and Rudy Giuliani and all of these characters who are associated with the president, bringing out new information, new potential things that implicate the president, and a big question about whether or not this trial will be a full trial in which there are witnesses and new documents and some of the information that was presented in the House that it was incomplete in some ways, whether or not some of those dots get filled with some of the witnesses that the White House and the president has blocked so far.
I think it's interesting that the key number here, at least for the next few weeks, is unlikely to be 67. It'll be 4. Whether Democrats can get 4 Republican senators to go along with a vote on witnesses, on new evidence, and that would also affect the time frame of the trial and could really affect the presidential race again as well. If they're able to stick to the schedule in '99 and even shorten it, which is sort of what McConnell's been hinting at, that they wrap this up the weekend before the weekend of the weekend before the Iowa caucus, these candidates can get back on the road. If there is a vote, though, that week for witnesses, you probably then have delay for depositions, and then not only are you disrupting the Iowa caucuses, but you're going into the New Hampshire primary, where again the senators who normally would go from Iowa and New Hampshire and just spend a week in New Hampshire going door to door and dominating the airwaves, they'll have to come back to Washington, and that could be really disruptive as well.
And in a year, especially when there are so many unknowns and there is a real jockeying for sort of who's leading the polls in Iowa, but New Hampshire is really a make it or break it state, it seems like, for the likes of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, 2 senators who will be stuck here in Washington for the duration. So do you have a sense, Michael, of how Democrats are building into their calculations and their push for witnesses what it may mean for the presidential contest?
I don't think that's become a major factor. I think the Democratic Party and the candidates in particular all believe there should be witnesses, and if that disrupts their presidential campaign, so be it. They'll work around it. You have a candidate like Elizabeth Warren who's tried to make fighting government corruption a centerpiece, like the central theme of her campaign, and they're hopeful that they'll be able to use impeachment to sort of shift the topic back to terrain where she wants to be talking about it. And that's possible. I mean, Bernie Sanders, could argue something similar, but I think it's just, there's so many things about running for president that you have no control over, and you have to come to terms with, and you sort of do your best. And this is just sort of a bright, shiny version of that that could be incredibly consequential. Or, we've seen for a long time the polls in Iowa to be relatively stable. It's also very possible that we go through the next couple weeks and we end with a 4-way tie at the top in Iowa, and everyone's as confused coming out as they were going in.
So, Michael, how much are you hearing people talk about impeachment on the campaign trail?
It hasn't really been a big topic. It's surprising how on the campaign trail, not only impeachment, but also even the strike against the Iranian military general last week, foreign policy. It showed up here or there. Some candidates chose to embrace it as an issue more than other candidates, but the voters didn't really embrace it. And I think that's consistent with what we saw in 2018, that voters are really focused on what they see as the emergency in their lives. It's very real for a lot of people, especially those who come to political events and are involved in politics right now. And that emergency has to do with the price of healthcare, the price of prescription drugs, education, the price of college. I mean, it's the sort of bread and butter issues that you hear candidates talk about. I think there's enormous fury generally within the Democratic Party about the way President Trump has handled himself in office, and so this, feeds into that. But it was already, at a 9.5. You can't really get much higher. And I think Ukraine hasn't really changed dramatically in either party approval ratings of the president.
What's the conversation before we let you go about the potential of Hunter Biden coming to testify? I mean, obviously Democrats are loath to even entertain that, but Republicans are trying to set this up as like an apples to apples. If you want to call John Bolton, you know, we could consider an exchange. For someone like Hunter Biden and then upping the ante to Joe Biden or someone else, the deeper the bench goes. Democrats say that's apples and oranges, that there's no comparison. Some have direct knowledge of this, some are sort of innocent bystanders by their opinion. So where does that leave Joe Biden and his camp as they try to like make calculations over the next couple of weeks?
Well, he said in the debate a couple days ago that, you know, whatever happens, happens, and he's going to do what he can, and his family will do what he can, but that concern over his son or his family being dragged into this is not a reason not to seek out witnesses. I think the most interesting dynamic in that playing out now is something Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, said yesterday, in which he basically said, okay, if we go forward with witnesses, I'm going to force a vote on Hunter Biden. I think a vote on Hunter Biden testifying would be a hard one to get a majority for if there's a majority for bringing witnesses generally. But Rand Paul's threat was, if you're a Republican and you vote against bringing Hunter Biden, that'll be the end of your political career. And so there's a weird chess match going on here. That the stick here may not be getting Hunter Biden to the floor. The stick may be forcing Republicans on the record that they don't want Hunter Biden on the floor, and then that being used as a political weapon against them next time they're up for re-election.
All right, Michael Shearer, national politics reporter, thank you so much. Tolu's going to stay with us. We're going to let you go. Tolu, tell us about the people who are going to be defending President Trump in front of the Senate, and just sort of how the White House has been thinking about that decision, right? Are we using attorneys? Are we using people the president has confidence in? Are we using House members, which they've decided not to?
Yeah, they've had a very important decision about whether or not they want to build the strongest legal case in these legal proceedings, or whether they wanted to have the best televised hearing for the president with the most combative theatrical defenders of the president. It seems at this point that they've gone with building the strongest legal case with the most professional defenders of the president, including White House counsel Pat Cipollone, who has led the president's legal defense through the impeachment process, even before that, going back to the end of the Mueller probe and the Mueller investigation. He's sort of earned his stripes with the president, and he has a very expansive view of presidential power. He has written a letter about how the House impeachment process was illegitimate and unconstitutional, and was the author of this idea that you're not going to provide any information to Congress, that the president was not going to cooperate at all with this investigation, which ultimately led to the second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress. But he stuck with the president. He's been very close with the president. He's going to lead, according to our reporting, he's going to lead the president's defense. One of the president's personal lawyers, Jay Sekulow, who does have some television experience and does have some media experience, is also going to be part of the team, according to our reporting. He's going to be providing his defense of the president. He's defended the president even before some courts that were deciding whether or not the president should have to turn over his tax returns. And he's expressed a very expansive views of presidential immunity, saying that President Trump is basically immune from any kind of civil or criminal prosecution while he's president, and only after his presidency can he be prosecuted or investigated at all. So he has also expressed expansive views of presidential immunity and presidential power, and I expect those views to be laid out during the trial as he presents a defense of the president. One thing that's important to note as well is that this is really the first time that the president's defenders are going to substantively defend President Trump on the substance of these charges. They did not participate, even though they were given a chance to participate in the House impeachment. And this is the first time that they're going to be officially saying these are the reasons why the president is not guilty. So far, it's been a lot about process. It's been a lot about how unfair the president has been treated. This will be the first time the president's legal defense will spend time defending the president on the actual charges of these articles of impeachment.
Great point. Tolu Olorunipa is my guest. Also, Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for The Fix. Thank you so much, Aaron, for joining us. You know, so much of the defense that was happening over in the House was about process. It was, a real pushback at Democrats. Aaron, could this feel and look very different as we see the president's team defend him?
Well, they're going to be asked questions potentially by Democratic senators, so they may have to be a little bit more specific and be a little bit more in the spotlight in a way that they haven't before. Right now, this is a process that's generally been handled through surrogates going on cable TV, people talking to reporters who want to talk to reporters. In this case, they can be forced to respond a little bit more directly to things that are actually being argued rather than, using talking points. I do think the defense is going to look somewhat similar to what we've seen from these Republican lawmakers in these impeachment hearings, which is the idea that the dots have not been connected here. This has not been tied to the president. There are a lot of theories that the president was involved and thoughts about exactly what he wanted, but those dots haven't been actually connected in a way that is compelling enough to warrant this very drastic step. I think that's going to be a centerpiece of this. The other part that I think they're going to have to do, given the amount of time that they're going to have to talk and some of the topics this is going to touch on, is they're actually going to have to try and poke some specific holes in the case rather than just arguing that it's not compelling enough. They're going to have to say this argument doesn't work because of X, Y, Z. And so that's kind of what I'm looking forward to seeing as far as the evolution of the Republican defense.
Okay, we're watching the hallway there right outside the Senate chambers because we do expect the proceeding to get underway at 2 o'clock as the Chief Justice, John Roberts, is sworn in, and then he in turn swears in members of the Senate as they prepare for this trial. They're taking a different oath than they would normally as a senator. And so we'll get to hear that language, we'll get to see that moment, and we'll see the senators pledge to be impartial throughout this process as they weigh the future of President Trump. A lot of news in the last 24 hours alone. The Government Accountability Office came out with a report that says that President Trump broke the law and that the Trump team at the administration did not go through this proper procedure as it held back aid for Ukraine. So this is the question that has been on the table. Was this just presidential power? Is this just what they're allowed to do? Or was there almost like a crime in essence, Aaron? So that is significant in the eyes of Democrats this morning.
Yeah, and so basically the GAO report boils down to if you are an administration and you are withholding funds that have been appropriated by Congress, that have been deliberately appropriated by Congress, and which has the power of the purse under the Constitution, you have to have a very narrow reason to do that. You have to have a very specific justification for that to be allowed. You can't just do it because you don't like that money being appropriated or you have a change in policy, because that kind of overrides the idea that the Congress is actually responsible for spending money. And basically what the GAO report said is that the reasons that were supplied by the administration don't satisfy the requirements for holding up money like this. They suggest it was done for policy reasons, which is basically what the administration said in justifying it. And so two upshots. One is that I think this undermines one of the chief Republican defenses here, which is that Democrats didn't even accuse the president of a crime in the article of impeachment. How can you impeach a guy if he didn't actually commit a crime? Well, here we have a nonpartisan government watchdog that's saying essentially not that this person is being indicted because they committed a crime, but this ran afoul of the law. The withholding of money, which was used as leverage in Ukraine, was actually something that ran counter to what the law allows. The second thing, though, is that this is going to be a rhetorical device and not something that, practically speaking, is going to matter. The Government Accountability Office is a watchdog, but its recourse is generally to be able to sue the government to, in this case, it would be release those funds that it hasn't been releasing. Well, those funds have already been released, so there's really there's nothing for them to do right now. So really, this is a rhetorical device at this point. It's a significant report because it does say that this ran afoul of the law, but right now, that's really the only thing that it's going to mean moving forward.
Another stream of news right now is what's coming out from Lev Parnas, who was this associate of Rudy Giuliani, who's already under indictment himself. He went on national television last night on the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC. Also, information that he'd given over to House Democrats was released 2 nights ago as well as last night. How is the White House responding to this, Tolu?
Well, so far they have not given much of a response. distanced themselves from Lev Parnas. This is someone who has showed up in a number of pictures with President Trump, and last night he gave a number of interviews that said that he was very close to President Trump. He had, private dinners in small groups with the president, and that he was working directly with the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, on a daily basis to carry out this scheme to pressure the Ukrainian government. And he has provided some documents and some information that has backed up his account. And there are a number of pictures that show that he and Rudy Giuliani were also very close and that they were spending a lot of time together. And he has basically tried to implicate the president further by saying that President Trump was aware of this. He's even implicated the vice president, saying that the vice president, Mike Pence, was aware of this broader scheme to try to pressure Ukraine to include, to announce investigations of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. And if they didn't do that, that there would be all these repercussions, including no White House meeting, nobody coming to the inauguration for the new president, no aid going over from the U.S. to Ukraine. And he said one thing in his interview about how he's sort of someone who would not ordinarily be having these meetings in Ukraine with top officials. The reason he was able to get into these meetings was because he was close to Rudy Giuliani, because he was carrying out the message that the President of the United States wanted him to carry out, and he had the background of someone who was close to the President, and that will be very important for this trial.
Let's listen to a quick soundbite from that. This is from Rachel Maddow's show last night when Lev Parnas is directly implicating President Trump.
What do you think is the main inaccuracy or the main lie that's being told that you feel like you can correct?
That the president didn't know what was going on. President Trump knew exactly what was going on. He was aware of all of my movements. I wouldn't do anything without the consent of Rudy Giuliani or the president. I have no intent, I have no reason to speak to any of these officials. I mean, they have no reason to speak to me. Why would President Zelensky's inner circle or Minister Avakov or all these people or President Poroshenko meet with me? Who am I? They were told to meet with me, and that's the secret that they're trying to keep. I was on the ground doing their work.
All right, Lev Parnas talking to Rachel Maddow last night. Aaron, what are your takeaways, strongest takeaways from the interview, but also the documents that came out this week?
Well, the interview, I think it's important to note that Lev Parnas is a wild card here. We don't know much about him beyond the fact that he's indicted and seems to want to tell a whole lot of things about what he says happened here. His credibility is certainly going to be in question because of who he is and the fact that he's under indictment. So we should color all of our assumptions about what he says based upon that. I think it is important to know, though, as Toulouse said, he has documentation that backs up his proximity to these people who were the main movers here, most notably Rudy Giuliani. It's evident that he was serving as a translator for Rudy Giuliani. He was dealing directly with the then Prosecutor General of Ukraine. I don't know that many people in this country have a direct line to Attorney General Barr and could get him to text back and forth with them. So I think that part of what Lev Parnas is saying rings true. He was certainly viewed as somebody who was acting at least along with Rudy Giuliani, if not acting on behalf of the President of the United States. As far as the documents go, the most interesting thing to me yesterday was there was another exchange between Lev Parnas and the then Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Yuri Lutsenko, in which Lutsenko and him were kind of going at it a little bit. There was a little bit of frustration on both sides about this deal that wasn't coming to fruition. And in one of the text messages, Lutsenko says to him something to the effect of, "You're not helping me, and here I am preparing to thrash your opponent." The current Ukrainian government has insisted that they didn't feel pressure in the call with Trump on July 25th, that they don't see anything necessarily wrong with it. They've been very diplomatic because they need to retain these ties to the United States. They don't want to alienate Donald Trump. These private text messages make pretty clear that at least the previous administration understood what this effort was about. It was not about broadly corruption fighting in Ukraine. It was about the president getting information about the Bidens. And I think that particular text message tells that story better than just about anything I've seen.
But where does that go, right? Where does this information go?
I mean, well, there's a real question about whether it's going to be included in this trial. We saw Susan Collins comment this week, I think it was yesterday, where she was, and we talked about this yesterday, she suggested that this information should have been put forward in the House when the House was doing its impeachment inquiry, and maybe she's not convinced that this is going to be a part of the Senate trial. I think ultimately what matters most is what's known publicly. So to the extent all this information is in the public realm, people can consume it and decide how they feel about it ahead of the 2020 election. But certainly a Senate trial provides a kind of a conduit for getting that information out. And if Democrats can get a few Republicans, can get 4 Republicans on board to say, we want to hear from John Bolton, we think Lev Parnas' information is important, that would be a significant rhetorical and symbolic victory for them.
Let's point out that it's 2 o'clock Eastern time, and so at any moment now we do expect the Chief Justice John Roberts to appear. He will be escorted by 4 people. We heard them named earlier today. The Republicans, Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and on the Democratic side of the aisle, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont and Senator Dianne Feinstein of California. This process will begin, and it will have all of the weight and all of the history of only the 3rd time ever that a president has gone through this impeachment trial process in the Senate. I see Mitch McConnell there, the leader of the Senate. So let's go live now. Thanks so much to Tolu and Aaron. We're going to stand by as things get underway.
I'm about to suggest the absence of a quorum. For the information of all of our colleagues, this will be a live quorum. Following that, we will consider the articles of impeachment, which will commence with the swearing in of the Chief Justice of the United States and all senators. Accordingly, then, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
We'll call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
A quorum is present under the previous order at the hour of 2 p.m., that time arriving, and a quorum have been established. The Senate will proceed to consideration of the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, at this time, pursuant to Rule 4 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment and the United States Constitution, the presiding officer will now administer the oath to John G. Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States.
Previous order, the Escort Committee will now conduct the Chief Justice of the United States to the dais to be administered the oath. I'm going to do announcement here first.
Senators, I attend the Senate in conformity with your notice for the purpose of joining with you for the trial of the President of the United States. I am now prepared to take the oath.
Will you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws, so help you God?
I do.
God bless you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I will administer the oath to all senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution and the Senate's impeachment rules. Will all senators now stand or remain standing and raise their right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God? The clerk will call the names in groups of 4, and senators will present themselves at the desk to sign the oath book.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett.
You're watching live coverage from the Washington Post as the senators put their names in the book. The only Senator, Aaron, who's not there today is Senator Inhofe. We've been told he has a family medical issue he's dealing with, so he hasn't been present on the Senate floor today. But rest assured, he will be sworn in and brought into this process when he is ready to be.
Yeah, and a reminder that, you know, unforeseen things happen during these trials. The thresholds for the rules and for ultimately whether to remove the president or not will change depending on how many senators are there. If a Republican senator is missing for any reason, the threshold for Democrats to get the votes they need to admit witnesses or new documents would drop to just 3 Republican senators. You know, things like this do happen. People have health issues, people have family emergencies. So we may not have a completely consistent jury box, so to speak, in this trial.
Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker.
You can hear the senators' names being called in groups of 4 as they go up to sign their names. We're listening today to hear if we get an indication of who exactly the president's legal team will be, because we'll see how much information Leader McConnell gives us today, or if he leaves some of the housekeeping for Tuesday of next week as things get underway in a more substantive way. You know, our Washington Post reporting has pointed out that Pat Cipollone, Jay Sekulow, expected to be members of the president's legal team. But this would be the moment where we'd find out exactly who would have privileges on the floor, who would be allowed there to present information and evidence.
Mr. Bozeman.
Right, and Cipollone is the one who's kind of been rumored to be involved in this from the start. I think Sekulow, I think you guys were talking about, has experience kind of on the public stage. Media savvy, can give a presentation that might be compelling to people just from a theatrical standpoint. So we'll see. That's the next major question in this process, because after today, this isn't really going to begin in formal ways until Tuesday, when they start with opening statements, which is when we think that's going to be. So it's going to be kind of a hurry up and wait kind of situation here. But you're right, the next big question is does McConnell tell us who's going to be the president's, effectively his defense team?
Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper.
We've been listening for news from our reporters on Capitol Hill as they've talked to senators in the hallway. You know, usually there is so much access to members of Congress on Capitol Hill, and it really is one of the beauties of the system, that you can be there talking to senators, talking to House members as a representative of the media. A lot of concern by media organizations at the kind of the clampdown that's happening during this process of access to senators. But as our team has been talking to them, the real question has been, will Republican senators give some ground and decide that witnesses should be part of this process?
I think you're going to see from the very beginning an unwillingness to commit to that. They will say that it's too early in the process. They've already offered comments similar to that. Basically, there will be opening statements that will last a number of days. There will be chances for the senators to request, to ask questions of either side's impeachment managers. And then at that point, we'll get to the phase 3. The phase 3 is where senators can write down their questions, pass them along, and or rather have this actual vote on whether we see new information, whether we see new witnesses. And so what we've seen from the likes of Lisa Murkowski, from Susan Collins, even a little bit from Mitt Romney, who has said, I want to see John Bolton testify and will probably vote for that. He said, things can change based upon what we see early in the trial. It's premature for me to say I would vote this way on this piece of evidence or this witness, because we just don't know what the trial is going to be like at that point. So, we'll try to glean clues about which witnesses might be admitted and what new evidence might be submitted for the record. But I don't think we're going to have a firm sense of that until we get closer to that stage of the trial.
Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for The Fix, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let you go, and we're going to stay with this. 4 members of this body are running for president still. Of course, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. We also see Amy Klobuchar as a member of this body. You saw her join the other 2 on stage this past week at the Tuesday night CNN debate. Michael Bennet is also still running for president. He is a member of this body, senator from Colorado, and while he's not hitting the fundraising and contributor thresholds to get on those debate stages, he's not given up his quest to become president, so he is also somewhat affected in his effort to become president by this trial. We know that Senator McConnell wants this to go much along the lines of the Clinton impeachment process from 21 years ago. 6 days a week, likely, starting perhaps around 1 o'clock every day. We're still getting the contours of exactly what this will look like, but that's what we anticipate. A break this weekend in celebration of the Martin Luther King and acknowledgement of the Martin Luther King holiday, but then starting Tuesday of next week, we do expect things to get underway, and we will see exactly how the Senate lays out this schedule. But everyone's expecting the senators to be here in Washington 6 days a week until this job is done, and that is meaning a real curtail of the presidential candidates as they try to do all of the Iowa and New Hampshire events, because the Iowa caucus is right around the corner. It's February 3rd, and 1 week later, the New Hampshire primary. I'm joined now in the studio by Natalie Jennings and J.M. Rieger, both of The Fix. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. Natalie, as you watch this process, this very ceremonial moment, what's going through your mind?
It seems, what occurs to me is that sort of halftime is over. We saw a very and things are going to be very different going forward. The House is a very separate beast from the Senate. We saw very contentious hearings, and I think this ceremonious transfer is sort of a good setup for what we can expect to be a little more of a somber completion of this process from the Senate after a month of a break, about a month of a break.
It was a long halftime.
Yes,
it was a long
halftime.
And you make such a good point, because this really does just set the tone. And the Senate does have such a different tone, and they like having a different tone than the House, right? The House is sort of seen as the people's house. The Senate is, by their own estimation, a more deliberative body. That is the goal. And so this gives us a sense of the decorum with which they hope things will go, sort of the procedural elements of this. We expect senators to have to ask their questions in written form. What a departure from how these men and women are used to just being able to be in the spotlight and have a moment on center stage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you think for you and I to sit there for 6 hours a day, probably at minimum, would be really difficult without any communication. But these are people who are, one of 2 people who represent an entire state, and the demands on their time are something that most people can't imagine. I know that members of Congress, there's a lot about how much they take breaks, but these are truly people with a lot of pressures and a lot of requests on them, regardless of what's going on in the Senate or, at that moment. And so So asking them to sit still and listen and not communicate for that big of a chunk of time is a really big deal, and doubly so even for those who would like to be running for president right now.
J.M. Rieger, so much else going on, and President Trump, I'm sure, would love everyone to know that USMCA, this North American, Mexico, Canada, U.S. trade deal, moving forward in some major ways today. Also hammering out a trade deal with Mexico, and the president trying to turn the news cycle to other issues, like he's working on prayers in schools today, something that his base is very interested in.
Right. We've had a lot of reporting throughout this process about Trump saying that he's not concerned about the impeachment, that this totally vindicates him. But given how much he's focused on it, and given some of the ways that he's tried to focus attention elsewhere, it does seem that he is trying to do kind of anything and everything, if you will, to divert from kind of the central news story of each day here, which is going to be this impeachment trial that's starting today. He had the Chinese leaders in yesterday to sign the phase one, as they call it, of the China trade agreement. As you mentioned, Libby, the Senate voted today overwhelmingly to pass USMCA after some labor concessions were made on the Trump administration's part. And yeah, this afternoon he is going to be talking about prayer. He's going to be making a speech on that. So these are all ways that the Trump administration and kind of Trump using the bully pulpit, if you will, as well, to kind of focus attention on the things that he wants to talk about, his priorities, and sticking to his talking points, if you will, on impeachment, on it being a sham political process, as he puts it.
Natalie, our reporters are, in the halls trying to get a sense of how Republicans are responding to the latest news about Lev Parnas, who went on television last night. We expect more from him today. We also saw documents come out related to Lev Parnas' accusations. They came out 2 nights ago. They came out last night. At this point, Republicans are, not saying that this is changing a lot in their minds.
Yes, and you can expect them to not say that and to sort of keep their cards close to their vests. This isn't changing sort of the way that Mitch McConnell plans to structure this trial. I'm sure his line on these things will be the same. This is something that he feels the House should have waited out, and he feels the investigatory burden was on them. So this, we can expect a pitch from him that this is irrelevant to what the Senate will do. He is on the same page as the Trump legal team, which would like to wrap this trial up in 2 weeks. It's getting harder to see that happening when you see things like this out. You need a great many of Republican senators will need to change their minds on President Trump in order to convict him. That the likelihood of that is still low. You don't need a great many senators to prolong this by calling for witnesses, for allowing more time to come out. And as we've seen, the more time that comes out, the more we learn. So,
Senator Mitch McConnell signing his name there, showing that everyone is a part of this. We just saw Senator Markey sign the book, and it reminds me that it's not just some of the members of this body who are running for president. There are members here running for re-election, and so what happens over the next couple of weeks may impact their re-election, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Markey's facing a primary challenge back in his home state, but there are some Republicans here, I'm thinking the Cory Gardner types, who are thinking about how this is playing back home, because they may be in purple states that are watching not just how the impeachment process plays out, but how their member of the Senate, how their representative participates in this going forward, J.M.
Yeah, Gardner is one of those names that we've heard floated in the past week or so who may join. So the Senate Democrats, assuming they all stick together, there's 47 of them, so they would need 4 Republicans to come over to call witnesses. Gardner's one of those folks that we've heard mentioned among that potential group of 4 Republicans.
Lisa Murkowski, who we just saw sign, is another one of them.
Yes, and Susan Collins, and we've heard Mitt Romney out there as well. Lamar Alexander is another name that's been floated out there. And to both of your points, this could prolong this trial, and if so, that could potentially, especially for the 2020 presidential candidates, kind of impact these early primary and caucus states. But for folks who are up for re-election, it puts an additional spotlight on them, an additional area of criticism, if you will, from their opponents as they run for re-election in 2020. So those are some of the key folks that we are looking for in this trial as it gets underway. At this point, we are not expecting, well, let me walk that back actually. We are unsure how some of these swing folks, these kind of group of 4 or 5 will vote on this, but we do know from the analysis that we've done at the Fix that right now there are 38 Republicans who have already indicated that they are more than likely to vote against both articles of impeachment. That makes it mathematically impossible. Senate Democrats could only lose 33 Republicans in the final vote. You need 2/3 of senators present to convict on one or both articles of impeachment. So the key to this trial is seemingly, it's kind of a foregone conclusion if this whip count holds that Trump will be acquitted. It's whether or not these witnesses get called, whether or not more damning testimony comes out, more damning evidence, and whether or not this gets prolonged and impacts where Trump is giving the State of the Union while this is still going on, impacts 2020 candidates in these early states, and whether it shines a spotlight on some of these vulnerable senators that you mentioned who are up for re-election in 2020.
JM, Rand Paul is someone who we just saw sign the book a few moments ago. He's a bit of a wild card here.
Yeah, so there's an interesting split going on right now among Senate Republicans. You're hearing some like kind of Ted Cruz and Rand Paul who are saying, okay, if you, Senate Democrats, if you want to call witnesses, if you want to call John Bolton or Mick Mulvaney, 1-for-1 minimum is what Ted Cruz said last night on Fox News. That means if you get John Bolton, we get Hunter Biden, or we get the whistleblower, or we get Adam Schiff. You've got other Senate Republicans like Lindsey Graham saying, no, this should have been done already in the House. We are going to take what you've sent us. We're not going to expand any evidence or any additional witnesses or testimony. And that is what we're going to consider, and that's what we're going to vote on. So the way that this plays out, both within the Republican conference in the Senate, but then more broadly on this vote, we're expecting at some point kind of midway through this trial for witnesses and whether those 4 Republicans come over to vote, as we expect with 47 other senators, is really kind of the key dynamic of this trial as we go into it, and whether anything additional comes out as this gets underway.
2 master politicians have been in control here, Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell. And this now moves into the realm of Leader McConnell, Natalie. He has worked to both please the White House and show the public that he's with the White House, and yet guide the White House to what he thinks is the strongest way to go through this process. For example, the president had said he'd like to see this vote happen right away, to just dismiss this entire thing and not go through this process we're having now. And Leader McConnell was able to sort of push back on that and give a counter argument that this would be a defense of the president. But he knows that that can't play it back home for members of his party. Talk to us about how Leader McConnell and the White House have been able to get on the same page here.
Well, I think one thing that is important in the background, speaking of electoral politics, Senator McConnell is one of those senators who is up for re-election next year. Now, he is from a deep red state of Kentucky, and we don't typically expect him to have a difficult challenge from a Democrat there. But President Trump is extremely popular in his state. One of our colleagues, Griff Witt, just went there last week to Kentucky and found, people in a lot of cases had stronger feelings in favor of President Trump than Senator McConnell. So that's important context when you're thinking about the way Senator McConnell is conducting this.
It's very important. I actually covered his re-election bid 6 years ago, and it was so interesting to see the loyalty to the Republican Party that Kentucky has now. I mean, it certainly was a Democratic state historically, but as I covered Senator McConnell as he was going through the state, the reception to him was a bit lukewarm. But what was at the time the big push was a counter to President Obama, and in this case, and this time it's a support of President Trump.
Yeah, and McConnell leveraged that desire for opposition to President Obama. I mean, he can make a case that he was the most important piece of that. Now he is also probably the most important person in the world in terms of helping President Trump get through his own agenda. First thing President Trump has to do if he wants to enact his own agenda is to get through this Senate impeachment trial remaining as president, and it's in both his and McConnell's interest to do that.
You see Elizabeth Warren signing the book there. We saw Bernie Sanders doing it just a few moments ago. We're down to the end of the final senators here. As this last, I believe it's like the last group coming through, JM, talk to us about these presidential candidates and how they're dealing with the situation they've been put in.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now. I think that A, about the length of the trial. B, as you kind of mentioned earlier in the broadcast, we're expecting this potentially 6 days a week, starting around midday each day, going till potentially 7, 8 at night, give or take. And I think there's an open question as to how much these candidates are able to get back, especially to the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and then get back the next day, what their ground game looks like, what their surrogates look like, their endorsements in those states, how active they are in helping them, because there is a chance that this is going on during the Iowa caucus, less than 3 weeks away now.
Any senator who was not in the Senate chamber at the time the oath was administered to the other senators will make that fact known to the chair so that the oath may be administered as soon as possible.
The Sergeant in Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, for the information of the Senate, on my behalf and that of the distinguished Democratic leader, I'm about to propound several unanimous consent requests that will assist with the organization of the next steps of these proceedings. They deal largely with necessary paperwork incident to the trial. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the summons be issued in the usual form, provided that the President may have until 6 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020, to file his answer with the Secretary of the Senate, which will be spread upon the Journal, and the House of Representatives have until 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020, to file its replication with the Secretary of the Senate. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document those documents filed by the parties together to be available to all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that if the House of Representatives wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 5 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020. Further, that if the President wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020. Further, that if the House wishes to file a rebuttal brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Tuesday, January 21st, 2020. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document all documents filed by the parties together to be available for all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that in recognition of the unique requirements raised by the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, the Sergeant at Arms shall install appropriate equipment and furniture in the Senate chamber during all times that the Senate is sitting for trial with the Chief Justice of the United States presiding. The appropriate equipment, furniture, and computer equipment in accordance with the allocations and provisions I now send to the desk and ask that they be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment adjourn until Tuesday, January the 21st, 2020 at 1 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Senate, sitting as court of impeachment, is adjourned until Tuesday, January 21st at 1 p.m.
This is live coverage from the Washington Post, and we will be back with you on Tuesday afternoon as this trial gets underway. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined in our studio by Natalie Jennings, editor of The Fix, and Lillian Cunningham, the creator and host of the Presidential Podcast. Thanks so much to both of you for being with us. Lillian, I'm so curious about what we're seeing today that we would have seen like 21 years ago during the impeachment trial of President Clinton, and then of course even 100 plus years ago of Andrew Johnson.
Right. So there's a lot that's similar. I mean, one very superficial thing is that the Clinton impeachment trial started around exactly the same time. The House had, pursued impeachment in December, and it went to the Senate in January, and we saw it play out in the first couple months of the year. What's different, of course, is the subject matter. Both for Clinton and Trump, there are 2 articles of impeachment that the Senate is going to be considering. But the nature of those, obviously very different, and the environment in which this is happening in terms of social media is very different. Also, I think it's important to note that this is the first time we're seeing an impeachment take place and then a trial in the Senate take place when the president is of the same party as the party that holds the Senate. So that's a very new dynamic from what we've seen in impeachments past.
Oh, such a great point. Natalie, one thing that Speaker Pelosi wanted to do was have impeachment managers that reflect her caucus in terms of like diversity, making sure that she has women, that she has people of color. She really focused on talking about people with trial experience who could present these arguments, this case before the Senate. But that is such a different optic than what we just saw with the Clinton impeachment. 13 white men last time. Now 7 people that are far more reflective of both America and the Democratic caucus.
Yeah, and it is different from then, and it's going to be a different look than what we expect to see out of President Trump's legal team, the people who will be representing him, giving for the first time to Congress his official defense. We think we know, there's no official word, but we think we know the 4 attorneys who were a mix of White House attorneys and President Trump's personal legal counsel who are going to be representing him. They are all white men. And so that will be a little bit on display, which I'm sure Pelosi took into account whenever she picked her team to be essentially the House's legal team in the Senate for this process.
Lillian, how different is this, or how similar is this to the trial of Andrew Johnson?
So, well, I mean, that took place about 150 years ago. So it would seem like there should be a ton of differences, right? I think what's similar, that's important to keep in mind, is obviously we've seen these impeachments happen at very divided times in the country, very partisan times. Andrew Johnson was the president after Lincoln while the country had been wrenched apart by civil war and was trying to find its way back together. So obviously, the most partisan environment we've ever seen in this country. I think, another thing that is similar is that in all of these impeachment trials, we've seen that prior to impeachment, there was already a really strained relationship between the Congress and the president. Impeachment trials that we've had in the United States are inherently political. And in all of these, we've seen that there's already been this sort of push and pull and frustration between the 2 branches of government before we even get to an impeachment proceeding.
Okay, so Clinton trial in the age of Twitter. I mean, one thing that we hear about for the Clinton impeachment process is that he was really trying to show that he was engaged in other things, that he was sort of above the fray as that was happening. Can you imagine, though, what the temptation would have been like if President Clinton had had Twitter at the time?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think one thing that's actually really interesting to note is that Clinton's approval rating, job approval rating, actually went up during the impeachment trial. Would that have been the same if he had been taking to Twitter all the time? I'm not sure. I would say, though, actually, in some ways, I think Andrew Johnson is maybe a better proxy for what we might have seen, like an Andrew Johnson in the age of Twitter. because he did sort of his equivalent for the day, which is while he had all these tensions with Congress, he went out on this tour around the country. It was, his form of social media at the time, and he went on this campaign called the Swing Around the Circle, where he basically just went town to town and railed on Congress, told voters to kick everyone in Congress out, used very sort of rude and derogatory language about how incompetent they were. So we have seen, even before, the rise of a Twitter presidency, we've seen presidents before sort of figure out ways that they can get in front of the American public and, convey their disapproval of how another branch of government is doing its job.
Natalie, the question of President Trump and how he uses Twitter is one that I think has Republicans a little nervous, maybe some excited, but it definitely has some in the Senate a little nervous because they would prefer sort of the staffers and folks that I've heard from in the Senate for him to just keep quiet and let them do their job and get this done, since at this point, given the numbers that JM was crunching for us, it's like a foregone conclusion unless something dramatic happens that the president will be acquitted over here in the Senate. So there's a question of whether President Trump will be able to control himself as he watches this process. I do see Senator Sanders there talking to reporters. Let's see if we can get some audio of that.
In withholding military aid to a foreign country. In other words, in demanding an investigation from that country. So we're at a moment where we have allegations that a president is using a foreign country to undermine American democracy. That is a very, very serious charge. That is what we can, and in my view, must focus on today. Thanks very much.
Senator Sanders talking to reporters there in that sort of underground area of the Senate. One question has been, how will the senators running for president be able to still connect with voters? And Natalie, our reporters who are in places like Iowa and New Hampshire talk about how politics is really nationalized right now. Like the voters are engaged in what's happening on the national stage. It's not necessarily the sort of the parochial issues that they're watching exclusively. And so it will be moments like this where the senators can come to the microphones and command the news cycle for even a hot minute that will be to their advantage if they can.
Yeah, and we do hear, have said multiple times today, I know already, that these senators who are running for president would much prefer to be in Iowa or in New Hampshire or wherever they think they need to be shoring up their presidential support. But I think it's a safe bet to say someone like Bernie Sanders, who already has a very settled national reputation, has a very big following, is probably less likely to lose out on that than someone like, say, Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's just barely hanging on to sort of the top half of the presidential candidate slate, who really needs a boost if she's going to stay in this race.
And that FaceTime and voter outreach would be very important.
Which is something that people in places like Iowa and New Hampshire,
absolutely, they're used to it. They're used to it. Absolutely,
they think they are in some ways owed it because they perennially get so much attention for before their presidential races, and I don't think anyone will set out to say, "Oh, they're not here. We can't, we can't support them now." But it really increments matter.
It's less about punishing them intentionally. It's more about, oh, I was able to hear from Senator Amy Klobuchar last night, and she said this thing that really connected with me. And if they don't have that opportunity,
and there's ways around that. Modern times now, you can get out on TV and you can connect with voters, but not if Senate rules require you to be in your chair, not communicating. Unlike President Trump, who may be in the Oval Office broadcasting his message however he pleases, Amy Klobuchar cannot be sitting there going on TV every
What if
few
just
minutes.
Nationally everyone could just put down their phones for the time of just the trial and have an electronics timeout?
Yeah, I don't think our bosses are gonna
allow
allow
us
us
we'd
one during this.
be allowed to do that. Lillian, what's going? That description that Natalie has of how these senators have to sit there and just listen and absorb and consume the information. It does feel so throwback. It's so outside of what they are used to being able to do as people who are just in constant touch with their staff and their constituents back home.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of the theme of an impeachment, right? Is that these have happened very rarely in American history. We've had 3 presidents impeached out of 44 men who've held the office. So in some ways, you know, there is a certain tradition that kicks in when something like this happens, that sort of takes us back to sort of more of a original way that the country operated.
Lillian, what will you be watching for over the course of the trial? Because I think of you as looking at things through like the presidential historian lens as well as the journalist lens.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of the things I'll be watching for are the same things everyone is, but with maybe a little bit more of an eye toward how it differs or feels similar to what we've seen before. So, you know, I'm very interested in how fast it's going to happen. For Clinton's trial in the Senate, it took about a month. For Andrew Johnson's, it took about 2 months. So I think the speed is a very interesting question. Also, I think, as I was sort of starting to say before, that this relationship between Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, I think, will be really interesting to watch because we haven't seen a president go through an impeachment trial in the Senate before where, you know, he's had something of an ally in the House Majority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader. So I think that to me will be fascinating to see because we really haven't seen any precedent yet for what that relationship looks like as it unfolds.
Well, so much that follows the course of history as well as so much that is unprecedented. Lillian Cunningham, the host and creator of the Presidential Podcast, thank you for being with us. And Natalie Jennings, editor of The Fix, thank you for being with us. Let's go now to Rhonda Colvin, my colleague on Capitol Hill. Rhonda, what have you been watching today?
Well, I know, Libby, that all eyes were just on the chamber action and what just happened and these procedural steps that'll take us to Tuesday's beginning of the trial. But I want to give you a sense of what the mood is here. I took a few laps around the Capitol and walked toward the Senate. And as you get closer to the Senate chamber and the Senate side of things in the Capitol, it's a heavy security presence. In fact, we were stopped because we had to show our credentials. And you really cannot, I don't know if you can see this, but you cannot get around the Capitol right now unless you have one of these. This has been issued by the police here who are trying to keep things orderly and, you know, because of the times we live in, make sure things are secure. And while I was walking through some of the Senate office buildings, I stopped by Mitch McConnell's office, and there was a protest, a demonstration brewing there where people had entered his office and were chanting. From what I could tell, they were very in favor of impeachment. They were wearing shirts that said "Impeach Trump now." So there is a sense that as we get closer to the trial on Tuesday, that things are really getting tense over here. And anecdotally, I can tell you a little story. While we were getting our credential here, there was a woman who was an employee of the Capitol gift shop. She was stopped by the police and told she didn't have one of these, and they told her, "You're going to have to find it or call your employer because we cannot let you pass this checkpoint until you have this pass." So things are really tight here, and I think that speaks to the importance of these proceedings.
All right, well, Rhonda Colvin, thank you so much, and we will see you next week as this gets underway. Let's end this day with a look at today's headline in the Washington Post. Here we go. Historic trial of Trump begins. We'll get that popped up in just a moment. There it is, and that says it all. This is the process. As my colleague Natalie put it, you know, halftime is over, and we are now entering this second phase of this process as the Senate trial begins. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Libby Casey, broadcasting live from the newsroom of the Washington Post, and we'll bring you this entire Senate trial live and uninterrupted in the days and weeks ahead. So please take a moment to subscribe to support our journalists, and you can do that on our homepage, or if you're on YouTube, by pressing the subscribe button, and we'll also let you know when action is happening over in the Senate. We'll be back here on Tuesday for the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. We'll see you then. Thanks for watching.